deep beneath the damp, fragrant soil of the American West, a quiet clock had been ticking for over 3,000 years. Long before the glowing skylines of modern cities painted the night, before the hum of interstate highways connected ocean to ocean, there was a silence here so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like a physical weight settling over the land. It was the spring of 1852. The frantic rush for gold was echoing through the river valleys of California, with thousands of men tearing at the earth in a desperate, noisy scramble for wealth. Yet, just a few miles away, moving higher into the mist-shrouded elevations of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the air grew still, cool, and thick, with the scent of crushed pine needles and damp cedar. The noise of the gold camps faded into nothingness, swallowed by the sheer immensity of the wilderness. In this hushed and hidden world, a man named Augustus was moving slowly through the underbrush. He was a hunter, employed to track game for the miners working in the valleys below. On this particular afternoon, the fog had rolled in thick from the Pacific, creeping over the coastal ranges and settling softly into the deep valleys of the Sierra Nevada. The mist turned the forest into a cathedral of gray and silver, muting the sounds of his heavy leather boots snapping twigs beneath his feet. He was tracking a bear, following the subtle indentations left in the soft, mossy earth. But as he pushed deeper into an uncharted ravine, the bear vanished like a ghost into the fog, leaving Augustus standing entirely alone in a landscape that seemed to belong to another world, or perhaps another time altogether. As the fog began to drift and part, catching the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun, Augustus looked up. What he saw made him drop his rifle to his side. Rising from the forest floor were pillars of wood so impossibly massive, so unbelievably wide, that his mind struggled to comprehend their scale. These were not simply trees. They were ancient sentinels towering hundreds of feet into the sky, their crowns disappearing completely into the mist above. Their bark was a rich, deep cinnamon color, deeply furrowed and softer than any wood he had ever touched. He walked slowly toward the nearest trunk, reaching out a hesitant hand to press against the fibrous, fire-scarred surface. The bark yielded slightly to his touch, spongy and resilient. He had stumbled upon what would later be known as the Calaveras Grove of giant sequoias. He was standing in the presence of the largest living organisms on the face of the earth. But in that moment, there was no science, no measuring tape, no cameras, only a profound, breathtaking quiet. The air here was older, heavier, trapped beneath a canopy so dense that only scattered beams of amber light managed to filter down to the forest floor, illuminating tiny motes of dust dancing in the stillness. To stand at the base of a giant sequoia is to stand next to a living creature that has observed the entire span of recorded human history. In the quiet of the forest, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the slow, methodical pumping of hundreds of gallons of water drawn up from the deep earth, defying gravity as it travels 300 feet into the sky. When the seed of the very tree Augustus was touching first fluttered to the ground, no larger than an oat flake, the Roman Empire had not yet been built. As the tree pushed its first pale green shoot through the dark soil, civilizations across the globe were rising and falling. While medieval castles were being constructed piece by stone piece in Europe, this tree was already a towering giant. silently enduring lightning strikes, heavy winter snows and raging wildfires, healing its own burns with a thick, protective sap. Augustus sat down at the base of the massive trunk, the soft reddish-brown bark offering a comfortable backrest. The adrenaline of the hunt completely left his body, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace and insignificance. He listened to the wind moving through the canopy far above, a sound like the distant rushing of the ocean. It was a hypnotic, rhythmic swaying. The great branches, some as thick as regular oak trees, creaked and groaned gently, singing a slow, ancient lullaby that had echoed through these mountains for millennia. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop, and the sky above the canopy turned a deep, bruising purple. Augustus knew he could not make it back to the mining camp before dark. He decided to spend the night in the grove. He gathered a small pile of dry twigs, fallen branches, and the papery cones of the sugar pines that littered the ground. Striking a match, he coaxed a small, flickering fire into existence. The yellow and orange flames danced against the cinnamon bark of the surrounding giants, casting long, slow-moving shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. The fire crackled softly, a comforting rhythm in the vast silence. He pulled his heavy wool blanket from his pack, wrapping it tightly around his shoulders. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean bite of mountain altitude. He leaned back again, sipping water from his tin canteen, and looked up. Through the narrow gaps in the massive branches, the first stars were beginning to appear. In 1852, the night sky was a brilliant, unpolluted tapestry of diamonds. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of milk, bright and clear. The stars seemed to pulse in time with the slow breathing of the forest. The history of the American West is often told as a loud, chaotic story of wagons, railroads, and rapid expansion. But the true history of the land itself is one of incredible patience. It is the story of water slowly carving the Grand Canyon over millions of years, millimeter by quiet millimeter. It is the story of glaciers inching their way across the granite faces of Yosemite, polishing the stone until it gleamed like glass. And it is the story of these trees, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark, watching the stars wheel across the sky, season after season, century after century. Sitting by a small fire, Augustus felt his eyelids growing heavy. The warmth of the flames, the soft mattress of millennia-old pine needles beneath him, and the protective, towering presence of the trees created a sanctuary of absolute calm. A small owl hooted somewhere in the distance, a soft, hollow sound that echoed gently through the grove and faded away. A gentle breeze rustled the ferns nearby. Every sound was muffled, cushioned by the sheer density of the forest. He imagined what he would tell the men back at the camp. He knew they wouldn't believe him. They would laugh, call it a tall tale born of exhaustion and too much time spent alone in the wild. But as he watched the glowing embers of his fire slowly turn from bright orange to a dull, sleepy red, he realized it didn't matter. The truth of this place didn't require belief to exist. It simply was. It was a monument to endurance, a testament to the quiet, unstoppable force of nature. As the night deepened, the fog returned, rolling down from the higher peaks and spilling into the grove. It wrapped around the base of the trees like a soft gray blanket, extinguishing the last few embers of the fire with a gentle sizzle. The world shrank down to the few feet of earth immediately surrounding Augustus. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin, breathing in the deeply soothing aroma of damp earth, wood smoke, and pine. His chest rose and fell in time with the swaying of the unseen branches above. The forest was watching over him, just as it had watched over the land since the dawn of time, offering a silent, comforting embrace to the weary traveler. The deep sleep of the wilderness took hold, bringing a quiet close to a day that would quietly change the course of American history. The morning light did not arrive in the Sierra Nevada with a sudden burst of brilliance. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate seeping of pale silver through the thick canopy of the ancient forest. Augustus awoke to the quietest world he had ever known. The fog that had rolled in during the night still clung to the damp forest floor, leaving beads of condensation resting heavy on the wool of his blanket. For a long while, he did not move. He simply lay there, breathing in the cold, pure air, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart. The air was incredibly sharp, carrying the clean, medicinal scent of crushed juniper and the deep, earthy perfume of centuries of fallen pine needles quietly returning to the soil. Above him, the towering red sentinels remained lost in the morning mist. He could only see the first 100 feet of their massive, cinnamon-colored trunks before they vanished into the gray stillness. A single drop of water gathered on the tip of a fern frond near his head, swelling slowly until it became too heavy to hold, releasing its grip and falling with a soft, muted tap onto a dry leaf below. It was the only sound in the grove. The sheer scale of the trees around him made the passage of time feel entirely different. Here, an hour was nothing but a breath. A human life was merely a passing shadow. Slowly, Augustus pushed himself up, the coarse wool blanket sliding off his shoulders. His muscles were stiff from the hard ground, but there was a deep, satisfying warmth radiating from within his bones, the kind of restful contentment that only comes from sleeping completely immersed in the wilderness. He moved deliberately, without rushing, picking up his tin canteen to take a long, slow drink of the icy mountain water. It tasted of granite and melted snow, waking his senses with a gentle jolt. He packed his few belongings with quiet, practiced movements. The leather straps of his pack creaked faintly as he buckled them down. He took one last, long look around the grove, trying to commit the feeling of the heavy, silent air to his memory, before turning his boots down the mountain. The descent was a solitary, peaceful journey. As he left the elevation of the giant sequoias, the forest gradually began to change. The impossible trunks of the ancient trees gave way to the more familiar forms of ponderosa pines and white firs. The fog began to thin out as the sun climbed higher, casting long, slanting rays of warm, golden light across the forest floor. Dust motes drifted lazily in these beams of light, glowing like tiny suspended embers. The crunch of his heavy boots on the dry earth provided a slow, steady rhythm, a marching beat that lulled his mind into a state of deep, walking meditation. By the time the smell of wood smoke reached him, the sun was sitting comfortably in the mid-morning sky. The mining camp, nestled in a steep valley cut by a winding, rock-strewn river, was just waking up. This was not the loud, raucous scene of a boomtown on a Saturday night. It was a Tuesday morning, and the camp was wrapped in a slow, domestic quiet. Canvas tents flapped softly in the gentle valley breeze. Men were sitting on wooden crates outside their makeshift shelters, nursing tin cups of black, bitter coffee. The rhythmic, soothing sound of water flowing over the smooth river stones provided a constant, calming background noise. Augustus walked into the camp, dropping his heavy pack near a communal fire pit that was quietly burning down to white ash. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a blackened pot, sitting on a flat stone near the coals. He wrapped his calloused hands around the warm tin, letting the heat seep into his skin. A few men looked up, offering silent, slow nods of greeting. Nobody spoke. The morning was too peaceful, the air too heavy with the lingering drowsiness of sleep to bother with unnecessary words. When Augustus finally broke the silence, his voice was low, almost a murmur, blending with the sound of the nearby river. He told them about the quiet grove high in the clouds. He described the trees, speaking slowly, trying to convey the impossible girth of trunks that 20 men holding hands could not wrap their arms around. He spoke of the soft, spongy bark and the canopy that seemed to hold up the sky itself. The men listened, their eyes fixed on the glowing embers of the fire. There was no laughter, no immediate dismissal. The way Augustus spoke, with such quiet reverence and absolute certainty, cast a spell over the small group. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time after he finished. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the wind rustling the canvas tents. But a story like that, even when whispered, possesses a slow, unstoppable momentum. Over the next few weeks, the tale of the giant trees began to drift out of the valley. It traveled not with the speed of a telegraph, but with the slow, meandering pace of the frontier. It was carried by men on horseback, their saddlebags swaying rhythmically with every step. The soft thud of hooves on dusty trails carried the secret across the foothills. The story was told in quiet tones over warm bowls of stew in lonely way stations. It was shared by the flickering light of campfires on the open plains, where the sky stretched out in a massive, uninterrupted dome of dark blue, speckled with millions of slow, twinkling stars. Imagine the journey of this news. Picture a heavy canvas mailbag being loaded onto a stagecoach. The driver, a man weathered by the wind and sun, gently clucks his tongue, and the team of horses leans into the harness. The wooden wheels begin to turn, a slow creaking rotation that kicks up a fine, soft cloud of dust. For days and weeks, the coach rolls eastward across the vast American landscape. It moves through the endless swaying oceans of prairie grass in the Midwest, where the wind creates slow rippling waves that look exactly like water. The passengers inside sleep, their heads bobbing gently with the rhythmic rocking of the carriage, dreaming as the miles slowly slip away beneath them. By the time the story reached the civilized cobblestone streets of the East Coast, summer had turned to autumn. The leaves in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were turning brilliant shades of rust and gold, falling softly to the brick sidewalks. In a quiet, dimly lit study in Philadelphia, a botanist sat at a heavy mahogany desk. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco. Rain was tapping a slow, irregular rhythm against the thick glass of the window pane. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow that pushed back the gray shadows of the rainy afternoon. The botanist carefully unfolded a piece of parchment that had traveled for months across deserts, mountains, and plains. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were clear. He read the description of the trees, his finger tracing the lines of script. He paused, leaning back in his deeply cushioned leather chair. The house around him was utterly silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a slow, measured tick-tock that anchored the room in time. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain, and tried to picture the ancient grove the letter described. Thousands of miles away, on the other side of the continent, those same trees were standing in the deep quiet of the mountain evening. The snows of late autumn were just beginning to fall in the Sierra Nevada. Large, heavy flakes drifted down from a heavy white sky, landing without a sound on the massive, outstretched branches of the giant sequoias. The forest was preparing for its long winter slumber. The bears had retreated to their dens, their breathing slowing to a deep, resonant rhythm. The sap inside the great trees sank down into their massive roots, protected safely beneath the frozen earth. This was the true rhythm of the American continent. Beneath the noise of progress, beneath the bustling harbors and the ringing hammers of the rail yards, there was a profound, enduring stillness. The land itself operated on a time scale that was incredibly patient. While maps were being drawn in quiet, dusty rooms, and while politicians gave long, droning speeches in the grand, echoing halls of Washington, D.C., the mountains simply waited. The rivers continued their slow, carving journey to the sea, wearing down rocks to smooth pebbles over millennia. As the botanist sat in his comfortable study, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The realization that such ancient, magnificent life existed out there, growing slowly in the undisturbed quiet of the wilderness, brought a deep comfort to his soul. He took a fresh sheet of thick cotton paper from his drawer. He dipped a brass-nibbed quill into a heavy glass inkwell, the sound a soft, satisfying clink. With the slow, deliberate strokes, he began to draft a letter to his colleagues, writing down the words that would eventually introduce the giant sequoias to the scientific world. The scratching of the pen on the paper was a soft, whispery sound, rhythmic and hypnotic. Outside his window, the afternoon light began to fade into a deep, velvety twilight. The street lamps along the wet cobblestones flickered to life, casting long, blurry reflections in the puddles. The city was settling down for the evening. People walked by with their collars pulled up against the damp chill, their footsteps muffled by the rain. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers, radiating a soft, steady heat. The botanist continued to write, lost in the slow, peaceful process of documenting history. It is easy to forget in the rush of modern life that history was not always a fast-moving stream. For much of the American story, time moved at the speed of a walking horse, at the pace of a handwritten letter carried in a leather pouch, or at the impossibly slow rate of a tree ring expanding by a mere fraction of an inch each year. The history of this vast land is woven together by these long stretches of quiet waiting. It is found in the sleepy afternoons on the porches of southern plantations, where the heavy, humid air slowed every movement to a crawl. It is found in the long, silent watches of the lighthouse keepers on the rocky shores of Maine, staring out into the dark, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves. And it is found in the deep, undisturbed slumber of the wilderness, where the giant trees stand watch over the centuries. As the night completely enveloped the botanist's study, he finally set his pen down. He folded his letter, the thick paper making a soft, crisp sound. He leaned his head back against the leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The house was quiet, The city was quiet. He closed his eyes, and in his mind he was transported back to that misty grove in California. He could almost feel the dampness of the fog on his skin. He could almost hear the wind sighing through branches that were older than the English language itself. He drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, lulled by the distant, imaginary sound of the wind in the pines and the steady, comforting beat of his own heart, echoing the quiet, timeless rhythm of the great American earth. The morning light arrived in Philadelphia with a slow, creeping gentleness, washing the rainy shadows of the previous night from the heavy mahogany desk. The botanist stirred in his deep leather chair, the soft rhythmic ticking of the hallway grandfather clock pulling him back from his quiet dreams of the ancient western forests. He opened his eyes, feeling the stiff but comfortable weight of his wool suit against his shoulders. The fire in the hearth had burned down to nothing more than a few delicate powdery gray ashes, carrying the faint, lingering scent of charred oak. Outside the thick glass of the window pane, the rain had stopped. The cobblestone streets of the city were slick and damp, reflecting the pale early morning sky in a series of slow, shimmering puddles. The world outside was still asleep, wrapped in the hushed, velvet quiet of an autumn dawn. He sat forward, his movements slow and deliberate, shaking off the heavy blanket of sleep. On the desk before him lay the letter he had written the night before, the ink now completely dry, the dark, sweeping loops of his handwriting holding the astonishing secret of the giant trees. He reached for a stick of deep red sealing wax and struck a fresh match. The small yellow flame flared to life, burning with a quiet, steady hiss. He held the stick of wax near the flame, watching with half-closed eyes as the hard edge slowly softened, melting into a heavy, glowing droplet. The wax fell with a soft plop onto the folded parchment, pooling into a perfect, thick, crimson circle. He pressed his heavy brass seal into the warm wax, holding it there for a long, quiet moment, feeling the heat transfer through the metal. When he lifted the seal, the emblem of a small, solitary oak tree was perfectly embedded in the hardening wax. The letter was sealed, ready to begin its long, slow journey across the American landscape. He placed his wide-brimmed felt hat on his head, wrapped a thick wool scarf around his neck, and stepped out into the crisp, cool air of the morning. The walk to the post office was a quiet, meditative stroll. The city of Philadelphia was just beginning to stir. A milk wagon rolled slowly past, the wooden wheels making a muted, rhythmic clop, 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 clop sound against the damp stones. The heavy glass bottles in the back clinked together with a soft, musical chime that seemed to hang in the damp morning air. The dampness held the smells of the city close to the ground, the scent of wet brick, the faint aroma of roasting coffee from a nearby bakery, and the crisp, clean smell of the nearby Delaware River. He dropped the heavy parchment envelope into the brass slot at the post office, hearing it slide down with a gentle, papery swish. From there, the story of the giant Sequoias moved on to the rails, joining the slow, heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of the American Railroad. Imagine the mailbag being tossed onto a train car, landing with a soft canvas thud among hundreds of other letters and parcels. The steam locomotive, a massive iron beast resting on the steel tracks, hissed and groaned softly as pressure built in its massive boiler. White steam curled lazily into the cold morning air, drifting upward and vanishing into the gray sky. The engineer pulled the heavy iron lever and the train let out a long, low, mournful whistle that echoed across the sleepy valleys of Pennsylvania. It was a sound that was both lonely and deeply comforting, a long drawn-out note that seemed to say the world was in motion, but there was no need to rush. The train began to move. The massive iron wheels slipped for a fraction of a second against the steel rails before catching, pulling the heavy wooden cars forward with a slow, powerful lurch. Chug, chug, chug. The rhythm was slow at first, the heavy pistons pumping with a mesmerizing, deliberate force. As the train left the city behind and moved into the rolling forested hills of the countryside, the rhythm smoothed out into a steady, hypnotic beat. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. The sound became a constant, soothing lullaby. Inside the mail car, a solitary clerk sat on a wooden stool, sorting letters into small canvas cubbies. He swayed gently from side to side, his body perfectly attuned to the rocking motion of the train. The swaying was like being in a cradle, a deep, gentle rocking that eased the tension from the muscles and made the eyelids grow heavy. For days, the train rolled westward, carrying the botanist's letter through the heart of the American landscape. It passed through the sleepy, fog-drenched valleys of Ohio, where farmhouses sat quietly in the distance, small plumes of gray wood smoke rising from their stone chimneys and flattening out against the heavy autumn sky. It crossed the vast, silent cornfields of Indiana, where the dry stalks rustled softly in the passing wind, a sound like millions of people whispering all at once. The landscape rolling past the window was a slow, moving painting of browns, golds, and muted greens, blending together in a soft, blurry haze that mesmerized the mind. Eventually, the train reached the banks of the Mississippi River, the massive, muddy artery of the continent. The crossing was a slow, deliberate affair. The train cars were loaded onto a heavy wooden ferry, the thick ropes creaking and groaning as the boat pushed away from the dock. The river was incredibly wide, a slow-moving expanse of brown water that seemed entirely unbothered by the passing of time. The water lapped gently against the sides of the ferry, a soft, rhythmic splashing that blended with the deep, throbbing hum of the ferry's steam engine. Standing on the deck, you could feel the immense, silent power of the river beneath you, millions of gallons of water making their slow, inevitable journey to the Gulf of Mexico. The sheer scale of the river, much like the scale of the giant trees, made human worries feel incredibly small and insignificant. It was easy to just stand there, leaning against the wooden railing, watching the muddy water swirl and eddy in slow, lazy circles, letting your mind empty out completely until there was nothing left but the sound of the water and the gentle rocking of the boat. When the letter finally arrived in Washington, D.C., it was carried into the hushed, cavernous halls of a government surveyor's office. This was a place of immense quiet, a sanctuary of maps, compasses, and old leather-bound ledgers. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old paper, binding glue, and dust. Great high-arched windows let in long, dusty shafts of afternoon sunlight, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes that danced and drifted lazily in the still air. A cartographer, an older man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a gray beard, sat at a massive, slanted drafting table. He carefully sliced open the wax seal of the envelope with a silver letter opener, the paper making a crisp, tearing sound that echoed softly in the quiet room. He unfolded the letter, smoothing the creases with his thumb. As he read the botanist's description of the giant trees in California, he stopped. He read the words again, tracing the ink with his fingertip. The dimensions were impossible. Trees over 300 feet tall, bark that was 2 feet thick. He looked away from the letter, staring out the window at the quiet cobblestone streets of the capital, trying to picture a forest on such a massive, unimaginable scale. The slow realization of what existed out in the vast, uncharted western territories settled over him like a heavy, comforting blanket. It was a reminder that no matter how many maps they drew, no matter how many railway lines they plotted, the American wilderness still held deep, ancient secrets, resting quietly in the fog. This quiet revelation did not spark an immediate noisy rush. Instead, it planted a slow-growing seed of curiosity in the minds of a few patient men. Over the next decade, as the 1850s slowly turned into the 1860s, small, quiet expeditions began to drift into the Sierra Nevada. These were not miners looking to tear the earth apart for gold. These were men carrying heavy, brass-bound telescopes, large wooden tripods, and incredibly delicate glass plates. They were the early photographers and surveyors, moving into the silent valleys of the West with the sole purpose of capturing the quiet majesty of the land. One such expedition moved slowly into the Yosemite Valley in the late summer of 1861. A man named Carleton Watkins was leading a small train of heavily burdened mules up a steep, winding trail. The air here was thin, crisp, and incredibly pure, scented heavily with the aroma of sun-baked pine needles and crushed sage. The mules plodded forward with a slow, rhythmic patience, their hooves striking the granite trail with a muffled, steady thud, thud, thud. The leather harnesses creaked, and the small brass bells attached to the mules' collars jingled softly, a delicate musical sound that carried easily on the still mountain air. Watkins walked ahead of them, his heavy boots kicking up tiny puffs of dust that settled slowly back onto the trail behind him. They were not in a hurry. You could not hurry in this landscape. The sheer size of the granite cliffs rising on either side of them demanded a slow, respectful pace. When they finally crested the last ridge and the valley floor opened up before them, Watkins brought the mules to a halt. He stood absolutely still, the wind rustling his heavy canvas coat. Before him was a valley of such profound, quiet beauty that it seemed almost unreal. Massive, sheer walls of gray granite rose thousands of feet into the deep blue sky, their surfaces polished smooth by ancient, slow-moving glaciers. Waterfalls looking like thin ribbons of white silk fell from impossible heights, the water taking so long to reach the bottom that it turned to fine, floating mist before it ever hit the rocks. Watkins decided to make camp right there, on the edge of a meadow filled with tall, golden grass that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The process of setting up camp was a slow, practiced routine. The canvas tents were unrolled, the thick fabric snapping softly in the wind. The wooden tent poles were slotted together, and the heavy iron stakes were driven into the soft earth with rhythmic, ringing blows of a wooden mallet. The mules were unburdened, their heavy packs lifted away, and they were allowed to graze in the quiet meadow, their tails swishing lazily at flies, their jaws moving in a slow, continuous side-to-side motion that was incredibly soothing to watch. Watkins unpacked his camera. It was not a small handheld device. It was a massive, cumbersome box made of dark, polished walnut and heavy brass fittings. He set up the thick wooden tripod, pushing the iron-tipped legs deep into the soil to ensure absolute stability. The process of taking a photograph in 1861 was an exercise in extreme patience. It was called the wet plate collodion process, and it required a slow, meticulous, almost chemical meditation. Watkins retreated into his small, dark canvas tent, completely blocking out the bright mountain sun. Inside, the air was warm and smelled heavily of ether and alcohol, a sharp, sweet scent that made the head feel slightly heavy and relaxed. He took a large, completely clear plate of glass, holding it delicately by the edges so as not to leave any fingerprints. With a slow, steady hand, he poured a thick, syrupy mixture of collodion onto the center of the glass. He tilted the plate gently, a slow rolling motion, watching as the thick liquid spread out in a smooth, even sheet, coating the entire surface of the glass. The excess dripped slowly off the corner back into the bottle with a soft, thick plink. He then plunged the coated glass into a bath of silver nitrate. He had to wait. In the absolute darkness of the tent, he sat on a wooden crate, listening to his own slow breathing and the faint rustle of the wind outside the canvas. 3 full minutes passed in total silence. The chemistry was working its slow, invisible magic in the dark. When he pulled the glass from the bath, it was no longer clear. It was coated in a milky, pale yellow layer that was highly sensitive to light. He placed it carefully into a light-proof wooden holder, closed the slide, and stepped out of the dark tent into the bright golden light of the late afternoon. The valley was entirely still. The wind had died down completely, leaving the tall grass in the meadow motionless. The giant granite face of El Capitan glowed with a warm amber light as the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks. Watkins attached the heavy wooden holder to the back of his massive camera. He draped a thick, dark cloth over his head and the back of the camera, plunging himself once again into darkness. He adjusted the heavy brass lens, twisting the knob with a slow, grinding sound. The image of the valley appeared on the ground glass screen, upside down and incredibly clear. He focused carefully, the sharp edges of the granite cliffs coming into perfect, crisp alignment. He tightened the locking screws. The camera was set. The landscape was set. Everything was waiting. He pulled the dark slide out of the holder, exposing the chemical-coated glass to the interior of the camera. He reached for the heavy leather lens cap. He took a slow, deep breath, holding it in his chest. The entire valley seemed to be holding its breath with him. He removed the lens cap. 1, he counted silently in his mind. 2, the light from the valley, the golden reflection of the sun on the granite, the deep greens of the pine trees poured through the brass lens and struck the wet chemical surface of the glass plate. 3, 4. He had to keep the lens open for a long time, allowing the slow-acting chemicals to gather the light. 5, 6. Nothing in the landscape moved. It was a moment frozen in time, a deeply quiet, perfectly still span of seconds where the only action was the silent, invisible absorption of light. 7, 8. He smoothly replaced the heavy leather cap over the lens. The exposure was complete. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the valley was instantly plunged into a deep, cool blue twilight. The golden glow vanished, replaced by long, soft shadows that crept across the meadow. Watkins returned to his dark tent to begin the slow process of developing the plate. He poured a developer solution over the glass, rocking it gently back and forth. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the image began to appear. First, the dark silhouettes of the pine trees emerged from the yellow fog. Then, the massive, imposing outline of El Capitan materialized. Finally, the delicate mist-like wisps of the waterfall appeared on the glass. He washed the plate in a heavy stream of clean, cold mountain water, neutralizing the chemicals and fixing the image permanently. He held the wet glass up to the dim light of a red lantern. There it was, a perfect, incredibly detailed slice of the American wilderness, captured in absolute stillness. As he stepped out of the tent for the final time that evening, the night had fully taken over the valley. The sky was an impossibly dark shade of indigo, completely saturated with millions of brilliant, unblinking stars. The Milky Way stretched across the narrow gap between the canyon walls like a thick band of glowing silver dust. The air was cold, biting, and pure. His companions had built a small fire in a circle of river stones. The flames were small, dancing lazily, consuming the dry pine branches with a soft, comforting crackle. Watkins sat down on a heavy log near the fire, pulling his wool coat tighter around his shoulders. He stared into the glowing orange embers, his mind feeling heavy, satisfied, and incredibly calm. The mules were resting quietly in the shadows, their dark shapes blending into the night. The occasional soft snort or shifting of a hoof, the only sounds they made. The river, a short distance away, rushed over polished granite boulders, providing a constant white noise rushing sound that completely filled the background, a sound that was so steady and continuous that the mind simply accepted it as part of the silence. Watkins thought about the glass plate drying safely in his tent. He thought about the men in the loud, dirty, bustling cities of the East Coast who would eventually see it. They would look at the photograph, and for a moment, the noise of the factories and the clatter of the horse-drawn carriages would fade away. They would look at the massive cliffs and the ancient trees, and they would feel the same deep, profound quiet that he felt right now. They would realize that out here in the vast, open spaces of the West, there was a peace that could not be manufactured. It was a peace that had been growing slowly, silently, for thousands of years. The fire burned down to a pile of soft, glowing red coals. The heat radiated outward in slow, gentle waves, warming his face and his hands. The heavy, rhythmic rushing of the river, the slow, cold winking of the stars, and the deep, silent presence of the massive granite walls pressing in on all sides created an atmosphere of complete and total safety. It was as if the valley itself was a massive crib, cradling the small camp in its ancient stone hands. Watkins leaned his head back against the rough bark of a pine tree behind him. His eyelids grew impossibly heavy, drifting downward, closing out the starlight. The smells of wood smoke, pine resin, and cold mountain dust filled his lungs with every slow, deep breath. He drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the incredible, timeless silence of the American West, a quiet slumber that would carry him through to the gentle, foggy dawn of another slow, beautiful day. The gentle, foggy dawn of another slow, beautiful day arrived in the Yosemite Valley exactly as it had for thousands of years, without a single sound. The transition from the deep, star-studded indigo of the night to the soft, pearlescent gray of the morning was so gradual that Carleton Watkins did not so much wake up as simply float back to the surface of consciousness. The fire from the night before was now nothing but a circle of cold white ash, completely silent. The heavy wool blanket draped over him was damp with the morning dew, completely saturated with the clean, sharp scent of the surrounding pine forest. He lay there for a long time, listening to the steady, hypnotic rush of the Merced River just a few yards away. The water poured over the smooth, rounded granite stones in a continuous, hushed murmur, a white noise that washed away any lingering thoughts of the bustling world far beyond the mountains. Slowly, the valley began to reveal itself through the thick, slow-rolling mist. The massive granite face of El Capitan emerged piece by piece, an impossibly huge wall of pale stone materializing out of the fog like a waking giant. Watkins sat up, his movements unhurried and incredibly deliberate. There was no schedule here. There was no factory whistle, no clanging streetcar bell to demand his attention. He walked over to the river, kneeling in the soft, damp moss, and splashed the icy, crystal-clear water onto his face. The shock of the cold was a gentle, invigorating awakening, leaving his skin tingling and his mind completely clear. The process of packing up the camp was a quiet, rhythmic meditation. The most important task, the one that required the utmost patience and care, was securing the glass plate negatives. Watkins retreated into the dim, quiet interior of his canvas tent. He took each heavy, delicate piece of glass, the captured silence of the wilderness etched permanently onto its chemical surface, and wrapped it in thick, soft layers of dark wool felt. The fabric muffled any sound, creating a perfectly dark, perfectly cushioned environment. He placed them one by one into the deep, custom-built compartments of a heavy pine crate. The lid was lowered with a soft, satisfying thud, and the brass latches were snapped shut, locking the ancient landscapes safely inside. The mules were loaded with a slow, practiced ease. The leather straps were tightened, creaking softly in the damp morning air. The small brass bells on their harnesses jingled with a sleepy, muffled cadence as the caravan finally turned its back on the valley, beginning the long, slow ascent out of the mountains. The hooves found their rhythm on the dirt trail. Clop, pause, a slow, steady heartbeat that echoed gently against the canyon walls. They moved at a walking pace, the absolute perfect speed for a human being to absorb the immense, quiet beauty of the world. Days bled into weeks as the heavy pine crates made their way down from the high altitudes, moving from the silent, ancient groves of the giant sequoias down into the dry, golden foothills of the California countryside. The journey was a master class in patience. The crates were transferred from the backs of the swaying mules to the wooden bed of a horse-drawn freight wagon. The wagon rolled slowly across the dusty plains, the massive wooden wheels turning with a deep, groaning rhythm that lulled the driver to sleep more than once under the wide, hot dome of the western sky. Dust rose in slow, lazy clouds behind them, hanging in the still air for hours before gently settling back onto the earth. Eventually, the glass plates reached the cool, foggy cobblestone streets of San Francisco. In a quiet, high-ceilinged studio, bathed in the soft, diffuse light of a north-facing window, Watkins began the incredibly slow process of printing the mammoth photographs. The studio smelled deeply of lavender oil, varnish, and old paper. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath his heavy boots as he moved between the large wooden vats of chemicals. He took the heavy glass plates and pressed them against sheets of paper, coated in a delicate layer of egg albumin and silver. These were not photographs that could be snapped and printed in an instant. They required the slow, patient cooperation of the sun itself. Watkins placed the heavy wooden printing frames out on the roof of his studio, leaving them to bathe in the natural daylight. For hours, the sun slowly, invisibly burned the image of the Yosemite Valley into the fibers of the paper. It was a silent transfer of majesty. When he finally brought the frames inside and washed the prints in a bath of gold chloride, the images emerged in deep, rich, incredibly warm tones of chocolate, sepia, and warm gray. The giant trees, the massive waterfalls, the endless granite cliffs, they were all there, captured with such breathtaking clarity and such profound stillness that simply looking at them made the chest feel heavy and relaxed. These mammoth prints, measuring a massive 18 by 22 inches, were then carefully mounted onto thick, heavy sheets of cream-colored cardboard. They were slipped into beautiful leather-bound portfolios, the covers stamped with simple, elegant gold lettering. And then the slow journey began all over again. The portfolios were carefully packed into the dark, secure hold of a massive wooden steamship resting gently on the calm waters of the San Francisco Bay. Imagine the slow, heavy departure of that ship, the deep, rumbling blast of the steam whistle vibrating in your chest, the massive paddle wheels churning the dark green water into a soft, white foam. As the ship passed through the Golden Gate and entered the vast, rolling expanse of the Pacific Ocean, it settled into a slow, rhythmic, rocking motion. The ocean's swells were massive and gentle, lifting the heavy iron hull up, 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 and then easing it down, down, down into the dark, watery valleys. Deep inside the cargo hold, surrounded by the scent of salt, tar, and damp wood, the leather portfolios rested in absolute darkness, swaying softly with the mesmerizing lullaby of the sea. The journey to the East Coast was agonizingly slow, a voyage that took weeks of patient sailing down the coast of Mexico, the warm, humid air of the tropics slowing every movement on the ship to a lethargic, comfortable crawl. The rhythmic thumping of the steam engine down below was a constant, soothing heartbeat, thump, thump, thump. It was a sound that traveled through the wooden floorboards into the soles of the feet and up into the mind, wrapping the passengers and the crew in a blanket of drowsy contentment. By the time the leather portfolios finally arrived in Washington, D.C., it was the early summer of 1864. The nation was entirely consumed by the loud, chaotic, and incredibly heavy burden of the Civil War. The capital city was a place of endless noise, the clatter of telegraph machines clicking frantically at all hours, the heavy, iron-shod hooves of cavalry horses striking the cobblestones, the shouting of newspaper boys on the street corners, and the constant, overwhelming murmur of anxious politicians moving through the crowded, smoke-filled corridors of power. But late one rainy evening, in a quiet, softly lit office on the second floor of the White House, the noise of the world was entirely shut out. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the wet glass of the windows. A small coal fire burned quietly in the marble hearth, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the deep green fabric of the carpet. The room smelled of old leather, pipe smoke, and the faint, comforting scent of rain. Sitting at a massive, cluttered mahogany desk was Abraham Lincoln. He was a man carrying an unimaginable weight on his shoulders. The deep lines etched into his face were a map of exhaustion. His eyes, dark and sunken, looked as though they had not closed for a deep, restful sleep in years. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, letting out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the exhaustion of the entire country. The house was finally quiet. The clerks had all gone home. The telegraph office down the hall was briefly, blessedly silent. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of a brass clock on the mantel and the soft, intermittent tapping of the rain against the window pane. Tap, tap, shh, tap. On the desk before him, resting heavily atop a pile of military reports and legislative documents, was one of Carleton Watkins's leather-bound portfolios. It had been brought to him earlier that day by a senator from California, a man who had spoken quietly about a place of impossible beauty far away from the battlefields. Lincoln reached out with a large, weary hand and slowly opened the thick leather cover. As he turned the heavy, cream-colored pages, the air in the room seemed to change. The thick, suffocating atmosphere of wartime Washington began to dissolve, replaced by the profound, ancient silence of the American West. He stared at the mammoth photograph of the grizzly giant, a sequoia tree so massive and so incredibly old that it defied comprehension. He looked at the deep, rough furrows of its bark, captured in exquisite sepia-tone detail. He traced the immense, sweeping branches with his eyes. He realized, with a slow, dawning sense of awe, that this tree had been standing exactly like that, in perfect, unbroken silence, for thousands of years, before the first musket was ever fired on American soil. He turned the page, the thick cardboard making a soft, incredibly satisfying swoosh as it fell flat. Before him was a sweeping view of the Yosemite Valley from Inspiration Point. The massive, polished granite walls of El Capitan and Half Dome stood like ancient, immovable guardians over the soft, grassy floor of the valley. The sky in the photograph was a blank, pale expanse, adding to the feeling of total, unending quiet. Lincoln stared at the image for a very long time. His heavy shoulders, which had been hunched tightly up around his neck all day, slowly began to drop. The deep furrows in his brow began to soften. For the first time in months, the chaotic noise in his mind simply stopped. The photographs offered a portal to a world that was entirely untouched by human conflict. They proved that out there, thousands of miles away, past the rivers and the plains and the deserts, the earth was still, incredibly still. The rivers were still carving the stones with quiet, infinite patience. The wind was still singing its ancient, sleepy lullaby through the crowns of the giant trees. The land was at peace. Lincoln leaned his elbows on the desk, resting his heavy, tired head in his hands, completely absorbed in the sepia-toned silence. He felt a deep, overwhelming desire to protect this quietness. In a world that seemed entirely bent on destruction, the idea of setting aside a piece of the earth simply because it was beautiful, simply to allow it to remain silent and undisturbed forever, was a profoundly comforting thought. It was a way to guarantee that no matter what happened to the nation, there would always be a sanctuary of absolute calm waiting in the mountains. He reached for his pen. The wooden holder was smooth and worn, completely familiar to his touch. He dipped the steel nib into the heavy glass inkwell, a slow, deliberate motion that produced a faint, muted clink. He pulled a fresh sheet of thick cotton rag paper toward him. It was a piece of legislation known as the Yosemite Grant Act. It proposed for the first time in human history that a government would set aside a massive tract of wild, beautiful land not to be mined, not to be logged, and not to be settled, but simply to be preserved for the quiet enjoyment of the people for all time. The scratching of the pen against the thick paper was the only sound in the room besides the ticking clock and the rain. It was a soft, rhythmic, whispery sound. Scratch, scratch, swirl. The slow, deliberate loops of his signature flowed onto the page. With those few quiet strokes of ink, Lincoln effectively created the foundation for the entire national park system. He signed the bill, gently blotted the wet ink with a heavy, curved wooden rocker, and set the pen down. He closed the heavy leather portfolio, running his hand once over the smooth, embossed cover. He leaned back in his deep chair once more, closing his eyes. The tension had completely left his body. The slow, rhythmic tapping of the rain against the window pane seemed louder now, a comforting, steady drumbeat that encouraged his mind to finally drift. He imagined the giant sequoias, thousands of miles away in the dark, their massive branches swaying softly under the light of the moon. He imagined the cold, clear water of the Merced River slipping silently over the granite stones. He imagined the deep, undisturbed sleep of the bears in the high alpine meadows. The warmth of the small coal fire radiated across the room, wrapping him in a heavy, cozy embrace. His breathing slowed, matching the deep, steady rhythm of the ticking clock on the mantel. The immense, ancient quiet of the Yosemite Valley had reached all the way across the continent, wrapping itself gently around the tired shoulders of the president, offering him a fleeting, beautiful moment of absolute peace. He sank deeper into the soft leather of the chair, surrendering completely to the heavy, comforting weight of sleep, while the rain continued its soft, endless lullaby outside the thick glass windows, washing the sleeping city in a blanket of calm, dark rest. The rain continued to fall over Washington, D.C., a soft, rhythmic drumming against the thick glass of the White House windows, holding the city in a deep, washing embrace. Inside the dimly lit office, the President of the United States slept a profound, untroubled sleep, his chin resting gently on his chest, his breathing slow and steady, perfectly synchronized with the gentle ticking of the brass mantel clock. On the heavy mahogany desk, bathed in the fading warm orange glow of the dying coal fire, lay the piece of paper that had finally brought his mind to rest. The ink of his signature on the Yosemite Grant Act was now completely dry, binding the law to the parchment. It was a quiet, unassuming document, yet it held the power to freeze time in the western mountains. It was a promise made by a fractured nation to protect a sanctuary of unbroken peace, ensuring that the giant trees would never know the bite of an iron saw, and the granite valleys would never be shattered by the clamor of industry. As the night deepened and the small coal fire finally surrendered its last glowing ember to the dark, the story of the American wilderness entered a long, beautiful era of profound preservation. The years began to roll forward, but in the high elevations of the Sierra Nevada, the passage of time remained an entirely different, incredibly slow phenomenon. The 1860s faded softly into the 1870s, and the 1880s slipped quietly into the 1890s. To the human world, these decades were a whirlwind of transcontinental railroads, expanding cities, and electric lights pushing back the night. But to the giant sequoias, this span of human history was nothing more than a single slow exhale into the mountain air. High up in the Mariposa Grove, the changing of the seasons was a slow, hypnotic waltz that repeated itself in absolute, majestic silence. Imagine the deep, heavy blanket of winter settling over the mountains. The snow did not fall in a raging blizzard. It drifted down from a heavy, slate-gray sky in massive, incredibly soft flakes. The snowflakes landed on the thick, cinnamon-colored branches of the sequoias without a single sound, stacking up millimeter by millimeter, inch by inch, until the entire forest was swallowed in a breathtaking, blindingly pure white. The air grew so cold and so incredibly crisp that it seemed to sparkle in the pale winter sunlight. Beneath the snow, the earth was resting, the roots of the ancient giants, reaching deep into the granite and soil, drank the icy, melting water at an agonizingly slow pace, storing the deep chill of winter within their massive, insulated trunks. When spring finally arrived, it did not burst forth. It seeped into the valley with a gentle, warming patience. The snowpack began to melt, creating millions of tiny crystalline droplets that gathered together to form small, trickling streams. These streams joined together, whispering over the smooth stones, slipping through the damp, fragrant moss, until they tumbled over the massive granite cliffs. The waterfalls of Yosemite, Bridalveil, Ribbon, and the massive Yosemite Falls roared back to life. But from a distance, the sound was not a roar at all. It was a deep, sustained, white noise hum. It was a heavy, vibrating rush that filled the entire valley with a sound so constant and so massive that the human ear simply accepted it as a form of silence. The mist from the falls drifted out over the meadows, catching the golden afternoon light and creating faint, hovering rainbows that slowly faded as the sun dipped behind the western ridges. Summer brought a dry, baked warmth to the forest floor, the air filled with the incredibly sweet, intoxicating scent of sun-warmed pine needles, dry dust, and the subtle vanilla-like aroma of the towering Jeffrey pines. The wind, moving up from the San Joaquin Valley, funneled through the high mountain passes, brushing against the tops of the giant trees. The branches swayed in a slow, sweeping rhythm, creaking gently, a sound exactly like the rigging of a massive wooden sailing ship rocking on a calm ocean. As the sun beat down, casting long, sharp shadows across the granite faces of Half Dome and El Capitan, the heat caused the pine cones to pop open with a soft, muted tick, releasing their tiny seeds to drift lazily down to the soft, spongy forest floor. Autumn, the season of deepest rest, draped the valley in incredibly rich, warm colors. The leaves of the black oaks and dogwoods turned brilliant shades of amber, rust, and gold. When the autumn wind picked up, these leaves detached from their branches and floated down to the earth in a slow, spinning, mesmerizing dance. They settled onto the ground, adding another delicate papery layer to the rich, dark soil. The animals of the valley prepared for the coming quiet. The mule deer moved slowly through the tall, dry grass of the meadows, their large ears twitching softly, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The black bears sought out deep, hidden caves among the boulders, their bodies naturally slowing down, their heartbeats dropping to a slow, rhythmic thump that perfectly matched the sleepy pulse of the earth itself. In 1916, Exactly 52 years after Abraham Lincoln signed that quiet piece of paper in the rainy dark of Washington, the National Park Service was gently brought into existence. But this, too, was a quiet endeavor. The rangers who patrolled these massive landscapes were men who understood the necessity of silence. They rode on horseback through the back country, wearing wide-brimmed felt hats and thick wool coats. The rhythmic clop, 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 clop of their horses' hooves on the dirt trails was often the only human sound for miles. They built small rustic cabins out of heavy, dark logs and rough-hewn stone, structures that looked as though they had simply grown out of the ground alongside the trees. When these early rangers made camp beneath the giant sequoias, they sat exactly where Augustus had sat in 1852. They built the same small, crackling fires. They boiled their coffee in the same blackened tin pots. They leaned their heads back against the incredibly soft, deeply furrowed, reddish-brown bark, looking up at the exact same stars. They were the silent guardians of the slumbering wilderness, watching over the deep sleep of the mountains while the rest of the country hurried endlessly forward. As the 20th century stretched on, the world outside the park became incredibly loud. Highways were paved in dark, smooth asphalt, stretching across the country like ribbons. Airplanes began to streak across the sky, leaving long white contrails behind them. Cities grew taller, brighter, and noisier, filled with the constant hum of electricity and the rushing tide of millions of people. But the borders of Yosemite and the deep groves of the giant sequoias acted as an invisible, impenetrable shield against the noise of modernity. Imagine a modern traveler, perhaps a century and a half after Carleton Watkins carried his heavy glass plates down from the mountain, driving slowly up the winding two-lane road into the Sierra Nevada. The heavy rubber tires of their car hum softly against the pavement. As the elevation climbs, the air conditioning is turned off and the windows are rolled down. The heavy manufactured air of the city is instantly replaced by the sharp, pure, incredibly cold breath of the mountain forest. The scent of cedar and damp earth floods the interior of the car, an olfactory lullaby that immediately triggers a physical unwinding of tension in the shoulders and the chest. The driver pulls the car to the side of the road, shifting the engine into park. They turn the key, and the mechanical hum of the engine completely dies away. In the absolute quiet that follows, the transition is almost shocking. The sudden absence of engine noise, of radio chatter, of city traffic, leaves a massive, beautiful void. The traveler steps out of the car, their modern shoes crunching softly onto the gravel of shoulder. They walk slowly down a well-worn dirt path, moving away from the road and stepping into the deep, cool shadows of the Mariposa Grove. As they walk further into the trees, the temperature drops noticeably. The light changes from the harsh, bright glare of the open sky to a soft, diffuse cathedral-like glow, filtered through hundreds of feet of green canopy. The sounds of the modern world are completely swallowed by the dense, spongy bark of the giant trees. The traveler stops at the base of a massive sequoia, looking up and up and up, until the trunk disappears into the dizzying heights above. They reach out a hand, just as Augustus did so many lifetimes ago, and press their palm against the bark. It yields slightly to the touch. It is warm, fibrous, and incredibly comforting. In this moment, the unbroken chain of history is fully realized. The traveler is standing in the exact same silence that the botanist dreamed of in his leather chair in Philadelphia. They're looking at the exact same shadows that Carleton Watkins captured on his wet glass plates. They're feeling the exact same profound, heavy peace that washed over Abraham Lincoln as he sat in the White House listening to the rain. The history of this place is not a story of battles or conquests or rapid, exhausting change. It is a history of standing perfectly still. It is a history of simply existing, deeply rooted in the earth, watching the slow turning of the cosmos with endless, unwavering patience. The traveler finds a smooth, flat rock nearby, covered in a soft, dry layer of pale green lichen. They sit down, resting their hands in their lap. They close their eyes. The wind moves through the tops of the trees, creating that deep, rushing, oceanic sigh. A solitary raven calls out from somewhere across the valley, a single, hollow, echoing sound that drifts through the air and fades away, leaving the silence feeling even deeper than before. The traveler breathes in, drawing the ancient pine-scented air deep into their lungs, holding it for a long, slow moment, and then exhaling, releasing all the accumulated stress, worry, and noise of the modern world into the vast, absorbing quiet of the forest. This is the true gift of the American wilderness. It is a massive, continent-sized reservoir of calm. It is a place where time slows down to the pace of a growing root, where the loudest sound is the cracking of a pine cone, and where the most important event of the day is the slow, gentle fading of the light as the sun slips below the horizon. As the afternoon slowly bleeds into evening, the golden hour arrives in the grove. The fading sunlight turns the cinnamon bark of the sequoias into pillars of glowing amber. The dust motes dancing in the air look like tiny floating sparks of magic. The temperature begins to drop again, a cool, soothing chill that signals the earth that it is time to rest. The traveler pulls their jacket a little tighter, feeling a deep, heavy drowsiness settling behind their eyes. The hypnotic swaying of the branches high above, the constant white noise rushing of a distant unseen stream, and the overwhelming sense of safety and permanence create a blanket of lethargy that is impossible to resist. Now, imagine that you are there. The bed beneath you is no longer just a mattress. It is a soft, fragrant bed of centuries-old pine needles, incredibly yielding and perfectly contoured to your body. The blankets resting over your shoulders are heavy and warm, wrapping you in the exact same protective embrace that the thick, foggy mist wraps around the base of the giant trees. The air in your room is the cool, crisp, utterly pure air of the high Sierra Nevada, filling your lungs with every slow, even breath. Listen to the absolute stillness of the room around you. It is the same stillness that blanketed the White House after the ink dried. It is the same stillness that settled over the wet glass plates as the image of the mountains slowly appeared in the dark. As you lie there, you're becoming a part of this deep, sleeping history. There is nothing you need to do. There is no destination you need to reach. There is no timeline you need to follow. You are completely untethered from the rushing clock of the modern world. Your heartbeat begins to slow down, syncing perfectly with the deep, slow, ancient pulse of the sequoias. Thump, pause, thump, pause. It is a strong, steady, reassuring rhythm. With every exhale, imagine yourself sinking just a fraction of an inch deeper into the soft earth, surrendering the weight of your body completely to gravity. The muscles in your forehead relax, smoothing out completely. The tension in your jaw melts away, leaving your lips slightly parted. The heavy muscles in your shoulders drop, sinking deeply into the mattress. Your arms and legs feel incredibly heavy, as if they are made of the same ancient, unmovable granite that forms the walls of the Yosemite Valley. The light in your mind begins to fade, mirroring the slow, beautiful twilight of the mountains. The glowing amber of the afternoon turns to a soft, dusky purple. The colors bleed away into a comforting, velvety gray, and finally into a deep, incredibly dark blue. The stars begin to appear in the sky of your mind, slow, winking diamonds that offer a faint, beautiful light in the absolute dark. The Milky Way stretches out above you, a river of silver dust wrapping around the earth, keeping you perfectly safe. The wind makes one final slow pass through the tops of the giant trees, a long, drawn-out that washes over your mind, sweeping away the last lingering thoughts of the day. The forest is completely asleep now. The bears are asleep in their deep stone dens. The birds are asleep with their heads tucked safely beneath their wings. The rivers continue their slow, gentle journey in the dark, a soft, liquid lullaby that plays endlessly in the background. You are safe here in the quietest place on earth. You are surrounded by the enduring patience of the ancient giants. They are standing watch over you, just as they have stood watch over the centuries, silently guarding the peace of the world. There is no more history to be written tonight. There is only the slow, rhythmic breathing of the forest, the comforting weight of the darkness, and the profound, beautiful emptiness of sleep. Let the heavy, peaceful silence of the wilderness carry you away. Drift down into the deep, undisturbed slumber of the mountains. Rest now, deeply and completely, in the endless, perfect quiet of the ancient American earth.